in the very heart of London, where ancient cobblestone streets snake their way between the proud monuments of empire and the steel and glass towers of modern power. A shadow has fallen. It is not the shadow of warplanes or tanks, not the smoke of bombs or gunfire, but the shadow of a new kind of battle, silent, invisible. Yet, just as dangerous at the center of this story is a single piece of land tucked into the borough of Tower Hamlets, a site that once housed the Royal Mint, the beating financial heart of Britain's past, the place where the crown's wealth was forged into coins of empire. Today, that same land has become the front line in a clash between diplomacy, security, and suspicion. The plan sounded simple on the surface. China, one of the world's most powerful nations, announced its intention to build a new embassy in London. Not just any embassy, but the largest in Europe, a vast complex of offices, halls, and courtyards, a fortress of stone and steel design, not only to serve the needs of diplomacy, but to send a clear message: China is here, and it is here to stay. But in a city as old and as wary as London, no construction project is ever just about bricks and mortar. Almost the moment the blueprints were unveiled, whispers began. Whispers of espionage, whispers of surveillance, whispers of a rival's fortress rising within sight of Britain's own centers of power. For Beijing, the embassy was meant to be a symbol of legitimacy, a declaration that China was not just another trading partner, but a world power deserving of prominence in the very heart of Europe. For Britain, however, the timing could not have been worse. The years leading up to the proposal had been defined by turbulence in UK-China relations. The streets of Hong Kong had erupted with pro-democracy protests, and London had washed with anger as Beijing tightened its grip on the city once promised political freedoms under the One Country, Two Systems Agreement. Allegations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang had further soured public opinion, and in a decision that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, Britain had banned Chinese tech giant Huawei from its 5G networks, citing security concerns. It was against this backdrop that the plan emerged, a sprawling new embassy compound in Tower Hamlets, and suddenly, the proposal became more than a matter of planning permission. It became a test of how much Britain was willing to trust, or how far it was willing to resist. The first alarm bells were sounded by intelligence experts. The embassy's chosen site was not just prime real estate, it was also dangerously close to sensitive institutions, government buildings, financial hubs, transport arteries, linking London to the rest of the country in the world of espionage. Proximity is power. The closer you are to your target, the easier it is to listen, to watch, to gather secrets. The Royal Mint site, with its vantage over key districts, looked to some like the perfect listening post. And so, in hushed meetings behind closed doors, British security officials began to ask a question that would echo through Westminster. Was this embassy a diplomatic mission or a Trojan horse? To understand why such fears ran so deep, we must go back in time. During the Cold War, embassies across Europe were more than just houses of diplomacy. They were centers of espionage. Within their walls, diplomats doubled as spies. Bugs were hidden inside light fixtures. Communication cables were tapped. Secret meetings were staged under the guise of cultural receptions. The game was old, and Britain had played it well. MI5 and MI6 had spent decades watching foreign embassies, knowing that within those seemingly ordinary buildings lay some of the fiercest battles for intelligence. And yet, even as the Cold War ended, the tactics of espionage did not disappear. They simply evolved. In the digital age, the embassy of the future did not need secret tunnels or microphones in the walls. It needed servers, data centers, and antennas. Disguised as flagpoles, it needed sophisticated surveillance equipment capable of intercepting wireless signals. It needed secure underground bunkers for encrypted communication. And when journalists dug into China's blueprints for the Royal Mint site, what they found only added fuel to the fire. Multiple underground levels, reinforced structures, vast communication facilities. On paper, it was all standard practice for a major diplomatic mission, but in the fevered atmosphere of mistrust, it looked like something else entirely. The infrastructure of a spy fortress in Tower Hamlets itself. The reaction was more immediate, more personal. This was one of London's most densely populated areas, already struggling with housing shortages, traffic congestion, and strained public services. For residents, the embassy plan was not just a matter of international intrigue. It was a matter of daily life. Local community leaders worried that the project would turn their neighborhood into a security zone. Roads closed, police checkpoints, protests and counter-protests erupting at their doorsteps. What was once a neighborhood of families and markets might transform into a battleground of diplomacy. With ordinary residents caught in the crossfire, some went further still. They argued that the land could be used for affordable housing or community centers, not for a foreign power's fortress. To them, the embassy was an insult, a reminder that the needs of ordinary Londoners were being ignored in favor of global power games. And so, while ministers in Parliament debated espionage and national security, In Tower Hamlets, the voices of the people rose in protest. Placards appeared, petitions circulated. A local storm was brewing to match the diplomatic one. The UK government, caught between its own intelligence warnings and the risk of angering Beijing, moved cautiously. Publicly, officials said little beyond the usual language of reviewing applications and considering national security. But behind the scenes, secret cables passed between departments. Some officials argued that rejecting the embassy outright would trigger a crisis with China. Retaliation could follow. Economic measures, diplomatic freezes, or even restrictions on British businesses in China. Others, however, insisted that the risk was too great. Allowing the embassy to rise in Tower Hamlets, they warned, was like inviting a fox into the henhouse. It was a clash of two instincts: the desire to preserve relations with a powerful trading partner and the instinct to protect national security at all costs. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another player watched with interest. The United States, already locked in a bitter rivalry with China, saw the embassy debate as another front. In its struggle, American intelligence officials quietly warned their British counterparts of the dangers. Washington's message was clear: do not let this happen. To allow Beijing to build a fortress embassy in the heart of your capital, they argued, was to hand them a weapon. The Americans pressed London to hold the line, to push back even if it risked a diplomatic confrontation. And so, what had begun as a simple planning application now stood at the intersection of global rivalry. London, Beijing, Washington, each saw the Royal Mint site not as a patch of land, but as a symbol of power, trust, and the hidden war unfolding in our modern age. By late summer, the storm reached a climax. Local councils in Tower Hamlets formally rejected the planning application. Their reasoning was a mixture of security and community concerns. On the surface, it looked like a victory for the residents, a triumph of local voices against global giants. But in truth, the rejection was only the beginning. For China, the embassy was more than a building. It was a statement, a permanent reminder of its presence in Europe. To lose that battle was to suffer a humiliation. And so, even as the council rejected the plan, Beijing signaled that the fight was not over. Appeals could be filed. Negotiations could continue. Pressure could be applied behind closed doors. The land at the Royal Mint remained untouched, silent. But the controversy had already reshaped the conversation. Trust between Britain and China was eroding. The specter of espionage lingered in the air. And the people of Tower Hamlets, who had once thought themselves far from the front lines of global politics, now found that the world's great powers were fighting their battles at the edge of their streets. This was no longer a matter of planning permission. It was no longer about construction schedules or zoning disputes. It was about power. It was about mistrust. And it was about how, in the modern world, even a patch of land can become a battlefield. As the summer drew to a close, one question that remained unanswered, echoing in the halls of Westminster, the streets of Tower Hamlets, and the offices of Beijing: was this embassy the dawn of a new chapter in diplomacy or the spark of a new shadow war? When the plans for China's grand new embassy surfaced, Londoners saw a building, but Britain's intelligence community saw something else. They saw a fortress. They saw antennas hidden in flagpoles, cameras disguised as security equipment, encrypted networks humming beneath the surface of the city. To the average passerby, embassies are about diplomacy, visas, passports, cultural events. But to those who work in the world of intelligence, embassies are something far more complex. They are safe houses, command posts, and sometimes weapons. From the earliest days of modern espionage, embassies have been the perfect cover. Protected by international law, shielded by diplomatic immunity, and recognized as sovereign territory, they offer what spies crave most: safety and secrecy. Inside their walls, surveillance devices can be built, data can be stored, and information can be transmitted across borders with little interference. And in London, one of the world's busiest intelligence battlegrounds, every embassy has always been watched. MI5 knows it. MI6 knows it. The Americans know it too. London may appear calm on the surface, but beneath its streets, beneath its politics, a silent game of shadows has been raging for decades. The Chinese plan to build the largest embassy in Europe was not just about size. It was about scale, a scale that worried Britain's security experts. The proposed site included not only offices and meeting rooms, but multiple subterranean levels, reinforced bunkers, vast spaces for communication infrastructure. To Chinese officials, these were practical necessities. To the British, they were alarm bells. Cybersecurity experts warned that an embassy of this scale could easily house data centers capable of launching cyber operations. With the right equipment, signals could be intercepted from nearby government and financial districts. Emails, phone calls, even wireless communications bouncing invisibly through the air. This wasn't paranoia. History had already shown what embassies could be used for. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had built an embassy in Washington, D.C., on one of the highest points of the city. From there, they could aim antennas toward American government buildings, eavesdropping on signals that drifted carelessly through the sky. In return, the Americans placed their own devices inside Soviet walls. sometimes embedding microphones in bricks delivered during construction. The technology has changed, the tactics have not. Inside Whitehall, debates grew more urgent. Secret cables began circulating, written in the cold, precise language of intelligence assessments. While the details remained classified, sources whispered of their contents. The embassy, they said, posed unacceptable vulnerabilities. Its location gave it line of sight to sensitive sites. Its infrastructure could support advanced electronic collection. In one particularly striking memo, an analyst reportedly warned, this facility, once operational, would represent a persistent and hard-to-counter intelligence threat. These warnings spread quickly through the corridors of power. Some officials argued that security concerns could be mitigated, restrictions could be placed, surveillance could be increased. Others dismissed such ideas as naive. You don't build a fortress. One source was quoted as saying, unless you intend to use it. But espionage fears were only one part of the equation. Politics made everything more volatile. Britain was already under pressure from the United States, its closest ally. Washington's intelligence agencies had long raised alarms about Chinese influence operations. They warned of companies tied to Beijing, universities infiltrated by foreign money, even seemingly benign cultural programs used as vehicles for propaganda. Now, the embassy became another flashpoint. American officials quietly but firmly urged London to reject the project. They pointed to their own experiences, Chinese diplomatic compounds in the US that had been linked, rightly or wrongly, to surveillance activities. To the Americans, London was not just Britain's capital. It was a global intelligence hub, allowing Beijing a stronghold there was, in their view, reckless. Across the Atlantic, the pressure mounted. In Washington, lawmakers and intelligence chiefs spoke openly of the dangers, and in private, they reminded Britain of its dependence on the special relationship. Intelligence sharing, cooperation, trust, all of it could be affected if London allowed the embassy to go ahead. Meanwhile, within China, the embassy was framed in entirely different terms. Officials insisted that the accusations were nothing but paranoia. They pointed to the outdated state of their current premises in Portland Place, overcrowded, poorly suited for the scale of consular services required by the world's most populous nation. To Beijing. The new embassy was about practicality, not espionage. It was about providing visas, hosting cultural events, facilitating diplomacy. The allegations of spying, they said, were politically motivated, part of a rising wave of anti-China sentiment in the West, and yet their insistence did little to ease suspicions. If anything, the more they denied, the more the fears seemed to grow, because in the game of espionage, denial is meaningless, trust is fragile, and suspicion once seeded spreads like wildfire. The press, sensing the drama, began to dig deeper. Journalists uncovered new details about the embassy's design. They reported on the underground structures. They highlighted the proximity to the City of London, the financial powerhouse of Europe. They questioned whether the embassy's communication facilities could double as intelligence infrastructure. Headlines grew bolder. Spy fortress in Tower Hamlets, one paper asked. China's Trojan embassy, declared another. The public imagination ignited. Ordinary Londoners began to see the project not as a building but as a looming mystery. What would go on behind those walls? What secrets would be gathered beneath their feet? Protests intensified. Residents who had once been concerned only about housing and traffic now found themselves repeating the language of espionage. Placards accused the embassy of being a spy base. Local voices merged with national fears. The story was no longer confined to political elites. It had seeped into the streets. And so, the controversy evolved. What had started as a diplomatic project had become something else. A story of secrets, spies, and suspicion. For Britain, the dilemma was stark. To approve the embassy risked national security, to block it risked diplomatic crisis. Either path carried consequences. Within Parliament, the debate grew fiery. Members of Parliament demanded answers. Could Britain impose conditions on construction? Could it limit the technology installed inside? Or was any such attempt futile, given that embassies are protected as sovereign territory? Every answer seemed unsatisfactory. Every solution seemed dangerous. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. Intelligence officials, hardened by years of experience, pressed for rejection. Diplomats urged caution, warning of retaliation. The Prime Minister's office weighed options, knowing that whichever decision was taken, the fallout would be immense. Yet beneath all the debates, one truth remained. The embassy had already achieved something, even before a single brick was laid. It had sown distrust. It had turned allies against each other. It had brought the whispers of espionage from the shadows into the headlines. The people of Tower Hamlets, once on the margins of international politics, now found themselves in the crosshairs of a global rivalry. Their streets were no longer just streets. They were stages, backdrops to a drama that stretched from Beijing to London to Washington. And as the weeks turned into months, the battle lines grew clearer. For China, the embassy was non-negotiable, a symbol of respect, a sign of power. For Britain, it was a question of survival, of how much risk a nation could tolerate in the name of diplomacy. The stakes were rising. And somewhere in the shadows, spies, real or imagined, were already at work. The embassy that shook London was no longer just an idea on paper. It had become a mirror, reflecting the deep fractures in the world order. It revealed how fragile trust had become, how suspicion had replaced cooperation, how even diplomacy itself could be weaponized. As Tower Hamlets waited, as London debated, and as Beijing watched, one thing became clear. This was not a battle about construction permits or planning regulations. This was a battle about the future of power in a divided world. In the long, echoing corridors of Westminster, tension was rising. What had begun as whispers in the intelligence community had now exploded into a full-scale political storm. The question of China's embassy was no longer just about national security. It had become a defining test of Britain's foreign policy. In Parliament, the debates grew fierce. MPs stood up in the House of Commons, their voices ringing across the chamber. Some warned of betrayal if Britain allowed a potential spy fortress to rise within sight of the City of London. Others urged caution, warning that rejecting the plan could spark retaliation that Britain was ill-prepared to face. One MP declared, "This is not simply about planning permission. This is about whether we allow a rival power to place a dagger at the heart of our capital." Another replied sharply, "And what, then? Do we throw away decades of diplomacy? Do we ignite a confrontation with one of the world's largest economies, just to appease suspicion?" The chamber shook with applause, jeers and shouts. It was clear this was more than a dispute. It was a battle for Britain's soul. Behind closed doors, the arguments were even sharper. Secret committees convened, bringing together intelligence chiefs, diplomats, and ministers. Intelligence officers spoke of persistent threats, of surveillance technology too advanced to detect cyber intrusions that could undermine the very foundations of national security. But diplomats countered with equal force. Britain's economy, already fragile after years of political upheaval, depended on global trade. China was not just a rival, it was a market, a partner, a player too powerful to ignore. Rejecting the embassy outright could trigger sanctions, retaliation against British businesses in China, or even the expulsion of British diplomats abroad. It was a brutal calculation, security versus diplomacy. To choose one was to sacrifice the other. And then came the leaks. In the summer heat, newspapers began publishing fragments of secret government memos. They spoke of divisions at the highest levels. One memo suggested that the embassy could pose a sustained and unacceptable intelligence risk. Another warned that blocking the plan could lead to significant diplomatic fallout with long-term consequences. The public, already stirred by headlines of espionage, now saw evidence of conflict within their own government. Confidence eroded. Trust in leadership weakened. Questions echoed across talk shows, radio stations, and social media. Was the government strong enough to stand up to China, or was it too afraid to act? For Beijing, the leaks were infuriating. Chinese officials accused Britain of bowing to anti-China hysteria. They insisted that the embassy was a practical necessity, nothing more. The accusations of espionage, they said, were fabrications, tools of a Western strategy to contain China's rise. Statements poured from the Chinese embassy in London, denouncing the opposition. This resistance, they warned, is not only baseless but harmful. It risks poisoning relations between our two nations. Privately, Beijing signaled that retaliation was possible. British businesses in China could face restrictions, trade deals could falter, diplomatic cooperation on global issues could collapse. It was a clear message: block our embassy, and you will pay the price. Across the Atlantic, the Americans saw opportunity. Washington had been pushing its allies to take a harder line against Beijing for years. The embassy dispute became another piece in that puzzle. American intelligence officials reminded London of their shared history, their shared secrets, their shared battles in the shadows. They offered quiet support, more intelligence, more cooperation if Britain resisted Beijing's plan. But behind the offers lay an unspoken threat. If London wavered, Washington's trust could weaken. Britain found itself squeezed between two giants, one demanding submission, the other demanding resistance. It was a dangerous place to be. Meanwhile, in Tower Hamlets, the protests grew louder. Residents carried banners denouncing the embassy, chanting slogans about spies and sovereignty. The story that had once seemed distant about cyber warfare and global rivalries was now their daily reality. Parents worried about police lockdowns near schools. Shopkeepers feared the constant presence of security checkpoints. Elderly residents spoke of their neighborhood being transformed into a fortress of fear. Journalists swarmed the streets, their cameras capturing the anger. Headlines spoke of local Londoners against Beijing. International media framed it as a clash of ordinary citizens versus a global superpower. Tower Hamlets had become, almost overnight, a symbol of defiance. And yet, within government, hesitation persisted. Some ministers whispered of compromise. Could the embassy be built, but in another location? Could security restrictions be imposed, even if it meant pushing against international law? Could Britain walk the narrow line between cooperation and caution? Every option carried risk. Relocating the embassy might anger Beijing further. Imposing restrictions might violate diplomatic norms. Approving the plan could undermine national security. The Prime Minister, faced with the impossible, delayed. Time was bought with vague statements about ongoing reviews and security considerations. But delay only fueled suspicion. Each passing week brought new headlines, new protests, new leaks. And the world watched. For China, this was about more than London. It was about global presence, about legitimacy, about demonstrating that it could claim space at the heart of Europe, just as the United States and others had done before. For Britain, it was about identity. Was it still strong enough to defend its sovereignty? Or had it become too dependent, too cautious, too fragile to resist? And for the United States, it was about strategy. Every embassy, every deal, every confrontation was part of a larger struggle. The global rivalry with Beijing, the Royal Mint, site had become a chessboard square on which three great powers placed their pieces. Each move was watched, each hesitation was calculated. By the end of autumn, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Tower Hamlets Council, reflecting the anger of its residents, formally rejected the planning application. The decision was cheered in the streets, hailed as a victory for ordinary Londoners, but behind the cheers lurked unease. Everyone knew this was not the end. China could appeal. Negotiations could resume. The pressure could return. The site remained empty, a scar of uncertainty in the heart of London. But the battle had already changed Britain. It had hardened suspicion. It had fractured trust. It had exposed the nation's vulnerabilities, and in Beijing, frustration grew. To be denied such a visible symbol of power was unacceptable. To be accused of espionage was an insult. To be humiliated in the world's eyes was intolerable. The embassy that shook London had become more than a building. It was now a weapon, a symbol, a story that would shape the future of global politics. And so, as winter descended, the world waited. Would Britain stand firm? Would China push harder? Would the United States tighten its grip? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. The battle for Tower Hamlets was not over. The war was just beginning. London's skies were grey the morning after the council's decision. For ordinary people, life went on. Buses rumbled through Tower Hamlets. Schoolchildren walked past the old Royal Mint, and shopkeepers unlocked their doors. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Britain had stood up to a global superpower, and the world had noticed. In Beijing, anger simmered. Official statements denounced the decision as politically motivated, accusing Britain of discrimination and hostility. Behind closed doors, senior officials debated their response. Should they punish Britain economically? Should they escalate diplomatically? Or should they wait, bide their time, and strike at a moment when Britain was weaker? Chinese state media blasted headlines about Western hypocrisy. Commentators warned that Britain would pay a long-term price for humiliating China on the global stage. It was not just about a building anymore. It was about power, pride, and the struggle for dominance. For Britain, the rejection carried risks. Business leaders feared retaliation. Investors whispered about instability. Diplomats scrambled to calm relations. Yet in living rooms across the UK, many citizens felt a quiet sense of pride. Against all odds, their voices had mattered. Their protests, their petitions, their fears had forced the government to act. For once, the ordinary had outweighed the powerful. In Washington, the embassy saga was seen as a small but important victory. Britain had aligned itself more firmly with American warnings about Beijing. Intelligence sharing deepened, military cooperation expanded, but some British officials worried, had they truly chosen independence, or had they simply fallen deeper into Washington's orbit? The decision to block China's embassy strengthened bonds with the United States, but it also made Britain more dependent on American support in an uncertain world. It was the same old story of empire and alliance, repeated in a new century. The aftershocks of the embassy battle rippled far beyond London. In European capitals, governments debated their own relationships with Beijing. If Britain could resist, should they follow? Or should they take the opposite approach, welcoming Chinese investment while London turned it away? In Paris, Berlin, and Rome, the debates mirrored those once whispered in Westminster. The embassy that shook London had now become a test case for Europe's future. Back in Tower Hamlets, the story was more personal. Residents celebrated their victory, but they knew it came at a cost. Security concerns had not disappeared. Tensions remained high, and the Royal Mint site, once filled with dreams of renewal, now stood frozen, a constant reminder of the global clash that had played out in their backyard. For some, it was a triumph of democracy. For others, it was a lost opportunity for development and jobs. The site had become a monument of uncertainty. And what of Britain itself? The embassy battle exposed deep truths. It revealed the fragility of its economy. Dependent on global powers, it could neither fully embrace nor fully resist. It revealed the sharp divides in its politics, where national security clashed with diplomacy, where pride clashed with pragmatism. Above all, it revealed a nation caught between giants trying to hold its ground in a world where superpowers played by their own rules. But there was another lesson, a quieter one, hidden beneath the noise of protests and the roar of headlines, the lesson of ordinary people. For it was not diplomats or intelligence officers who stopped the embassy. It was residents, families, shopkeepers, workers who refused to accept living in the shadow of a foreign fortress. It was their voices that echoed into council chambers, their protests that drew cameras, their persistence that forced leaders to act. The battle that shook London was, in the end, a story of ordinary citizens shaping the destiny of their city. Months later, the world had moved on to new crises, wars, trade disputes, elections. But in London, the embassy site remained untouched, empty, silent, waiting, a symbol of unfinished business. For China, it was a wound that time would not easily heal. For Britain, it was a reminder of the risks of defiance. For America, it was a proof that allies could still be swayed. And for the world, it was a warning. Even a single building could shake the balance of global power. The embassy that never was became a legend. Documentaries, books, and academic papers dissected it as a case study of modern geopolitics. Analysts called it a turning point in Britain's foreign policy. Students debated it in classrooms. Protesters pointed to it as proof that resistance was possible. It became a story bigger than itself, a story about sovereignty, about power, about the struggle of nations in a fractured world. Yet the future remained uncertain. Would Britain's defiance inspire others to stand up? Or would it serve as a cautionary tale, a warning of the costs of resisting a rising giant? Would China return to the Royal Mint site with renewed pressure? Or would it seek its influence elsewhere, in other cities, in other ways? No one could say for sure. But one truth was clear. The embassy that shook London had redrawn lines of trust, shifted alliances, and reshaped perceptions. It had revealed a world on edge, where every decision carried the weight of history, where even a building could ignite a storm. And so, the story closes not with resolution, but with a question, the kind that lingers in the air long after the cameras stop rolling. When the next embassy rises, when the next symbol of power is planted in foreign soil, when the next storm begins to brew, will the world be ready, or will it shake again?